In Babylon, justice had a scent, myrrh, smoke, and blood. The same hands that built the Hanging Gardens also built the first code of law, carved into stone. But every law has a price. For every decree of purity, someone's body paid the debt. So who truly bore the cost of Babylon's glory? Chronicles record triumphs. The stones beneath them still whisper screams. If you value the historical record, subscribe, because when the tablets end, the flesh continues the story. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. The Euphrates glided through the city like a vein of light, carrying not just water, but sanctity. On its banks rose temples to Ishtar and Shamash, their steps blackened by centuries of sacrifice. To the Babylonians, the law was not merely governance, it was cosmology. To sin against it was to tip the universe toward chaos. And so Babylon learned the cruelest equation in history, that purity required pain. Justice, they believed, could only exist if it was witnessed. And so they staged it. Every trial was theatre, every punishment a sermon. Citizens gathered in courtyards to watch transgressors punished in the name of divine equilibrium. The priests spoke of order. The crowd saw horror turned holy. This was the contradiction, at the empire's heart. A civilization that gave humanity its first written laws, its first astronomical maps, its first epic poem, yet defined obedience through spectacle. Babylon's brilliance did not shine despite cruelty. It was built upon it. It began with a proclamation carved in black basalt. A king standing before a god, one hand raised in devotion, the other receiving a staff of authority that shone like flame. This was Hammurabi, sixth king of Babylon, and the stone behind him would outlive every ziggurat, every dynasty, every god that blessed his throne. Upon that tablet of law, 7 feet tall and cold as eternity, he declared that justice itself was divine. In his vision, law was not invention, it was revelation. The Code of Hammurabi was introduced not as the product of men, but as the decree of Shamash, the god of justice. Every punishment, every clause, every hierarchy was sanctified by heaven's authority. By claiming the gods as legislators, Hammurabi achieved something more enduring than conquest: obedience without rebellion. Babylon at the time was an empire of astonishing complexity. Fields irrigated by canals, markets glittering with copper, and grain slaves from conquered cities, sold alongside incense and lapis lazuli. But order was fragile. Beneath the wealth seethed envy, lust, and the constant threat of chaos. Hammurabi understood that swords could command obedience only for a moment. Faith, however, could command it for generations. Thus, he crafted the first fully codified system of law, 282 rules carved into the basalt stela, now resting in the Louvre. Its language was surgical and absolute. If a builder constructs a house and it collapses, killing the owner, the builder shall be put to death. If a son strikes his father, his hands shall be cut off. The symmetry was brutal, the logic crystalline. Justice in Babylon was not blind, it was ornamental, displayed in balance carved in terror. The most striking line placed near the top of the tablet proclaimed Hammurabi's purpose: to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak. Yet beneath that sentence lay a darker truth. The law did not protect equality, it preserved hierarchy. In Babylon, weak and strong, were not moral categories, they were economic ones. The laws differentiated sharply between Awalu freemen, Mushkenu commoners, and Wardu slaves. The same act of blow, a theft, a death, was punished differently, depending on who performed it and upon whom. For the noble, a fine. For the commoner, a beating. For the slave, mutilation or death. The hierarchy was cosmic, not negotiable. Hammurabi's genius was not in inventing cruelty, but in systematizing it, making inequality seem sacred, an echo of divine order. By wrapping oppression in theology, he made rebellion a sin not just against the crown, but against the gods themselves. At the heart of this system stood an idea as seductive as it was terrifying, that morality could be measured, balanced, and priced. The law turned ethics into arithmetic. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Not mercy, not redemption, but transaction. A moral economy where injury was not forgiven but exchanged. A society where every wound had a price and every life a ledger. This was the birth of bureaucracy in blood. Scribes trained for years to memorize clauses. Priests recited them during rituals, and judges appointed by the king pronounced verdicts in the temple courtyards where incense mingled with dust. Justice was no longer an act of divine mystery. It was a profession, an office, a machine. The stela itself was more than a legal document, it was propaganda in stone. The top half, carved in relief, showed Hammurabi before Shamash, receiving symbols of power, the rod and ring. It was a masterpiece of divine marketing. Anyone who gazed upon the monument saw a perfect chain of authority: God, king, law, people. To question one link was to risk eternal damnation. And yet, there was genius in its cruelty. The code taught people not just to fear punishment, but to internalize surveillance. You did not need guards on every corner if the gods were said to watch every breath. You did not need to crush rebellion if every thought of defiance felt like blasphemy. Babylon's greatest invention was not writing or irrigation or architecture, it was the fusion of law and fear. Under Hammurabi's rule, that fear became a ritual. Before dawn, priests gathered in the great temple of Shamash. They poured libations of oil over tablets inscribed with oaths, chanting words that blurred law and prayer. May he who lies before the court perish in the river. The city awoke not to the sound of decrees, but of invocations. Law was not recited, it was worshipped. By sanctifying the code, Hammurabi built a civilization that appeared eternal. But in doing so, he also built a prison, invisible to the eye, the prison of moral obedience. The people no longer needed chains. They carried their fear within. Centuries later, empires would rise and fall upon the same principle. The Roman jurists, the medieval theologians, the modern bureaucrats, all heirs to Babylon's equation, that law is not a protection of the weak, but the performance of divine order. And so the stela endures. In the Louvre's pale light, you can still see Hammurabi's profile gazing upward toward his god, his lips parted as if whispering judgment. The surface gleams faintly, where fingers of countless pilgrims and conquerors have traced the words. The king is long dead, the god silent, but the idea remains. Justice carved in stone, fear written into faith. The empire of law began not with fairness, but with obedience. Obedience sanctified by terror. If Hammurabi built the architecture of order desire, was the fire threatening to burn it down? Babylon understood early what every empire learns too late, that no walls are high enough to contain the chaos of the human body. So the state learned to police not just actions, but passions. To control lust was to control lineage. To regulate pleasure was to regulate power. In the shadow of the ziggurat scribes recorded not wars or harvests, but the crimes of flesh. The clay tablets unearthed from Sipar-Larsa and Ur reveal an astonishing obsession with sexual conduct, who slept with whom, under what circumstances, and with what social rank. The law did not separate the sacred from the sexual. It fused them. Desire was a religious matter because the body itself was a divine instrument. To misuse it was to offend the gods, and offending the gods threatened the city. Thus began the surveillance of intimacy. Marriage fidelity, even fertility, were absorbed into the logic of law. Women especially were transformed into public property, disguised as private devotion. A wife was not a partner, but a contract, an extension of her husband's estate. The legal tablets used the same verb for both to acquire. To marry was literally to take possession. The Code of Hammurabi devoted over 30 clauses to sexual morality. It forbade adultery, but not for reasons of faithfulness or virtue. Adultery was defined as the theft of another man's property, the woman's body as collateral, her honor as currency. A man who caught his wife with another could drown her if he wished. He could also pardon her, but only if the king approved. The law treated mercy as a royal privilege, not a human right. In contrast, if a husband committed adultery with a servant or prostitute, the tablets fell silent. The gods, it seemed, were not equally offended by male desire. What they feared was the confusion of inheritance, the possibility that power might flow through an illegitimate womb. Babylon's laws were less about purity than control of lineage. The body of a woman was an archive of ownership, and the law was its lock. Archaeologists once uncovered a letter from a merchant named Abum in 18th century BCE Mari. He writes to his wife, ordering her to stay indoors and avoid speaking to other men while he is away on business. His tone is not affection, but command. Beneath the words lies a quiet terror, the fear that a single act of desire could unravel the moral economy of an entire household. Every home was a miniature empire, and every wife its conquered territory. The law turned private life into performance. Marriage contracts were drawn up before witnesses sealed with clay impressions and stored in temple archives. Some even specified penalties for infertility or disobedience. One surviving contract declares, if she bears no child within 2 years, she may be sent away or replaced by a concubine. Love was not the foundation of union. Productivity was. Yet Babylon's control over desire was not confined to women. Men too were caught in the web, expected to embody discipline, virility, and paternal authority. A man who failed to produce heirs risked social suspicion. A man too indulgent in pleasure risked ruin. The law taught that pleasure without purpose was rebellion. Sexual energy belonged to the gods, to be used only in service of fertility or devotion. And so the temples became paradoxes, places of worship, where sex was both forbidden and required. Priestesses of Ishtar known as Naditu lived in ritual seclusion, dedicated to the goddess of Yet, bound by vows of celibacy. In contrast, temple courtesans performed sacred intercourse to bless fertility festivals. The line between holiness and sin blurred so completely that Babylon no longer distinguished between devotion and defilement. But this contradiction served power perfectly. When law and lust merged, morality became unchallengeable. The priests dictated who was pure and who was profane. The king's code transformed bodily autonomy into civic duty. The surveillance of desire did not rely on soldiers, it relied on shame. And shame, unlike chains, needed no iron. Imagine for a moment the daily life of a Babylonian woman, her footsteps measured, her voice moderated, her gaze lowered when passing a stranger. Every gesture calculated against suspicion. She carried not only her jewelry and veil, but also an invisible sentence, the presumption of guilt should she ever forget her role. The veil, often thought to be modesty's symbol, was actually the opposite, a legal boundary. Only noble women were permitted to wear it. Slaves and prostitutes were forbidden from covering their heads. Modesty itself became a privilege, another tool to divide women from one another. In public squares, these distinctions were obvious. The veiled wife passed untouched. The unveiled concubine endured glances that were not invitations, but reminders. She existed outside sanctity, outside law. For Babylon, morality was geometry. Every person had a fixed place, every desire a measured cost. Over time, this system created a civilization obsessed with appearances. A woman's body was her social document, a man's restraint his credential. Yet, beneath the surface lay corrosion, a moral exhaustion born of constant vigilance. For when love is regulated, intimacy becomes transaction, and obedience replaces trust. The irony is chilling. The empire that codified law also codified loneliness. Its citizens learned to desire in silence, to dream under supervision. Even poetry, so often the voice of longing, was sanitized into prayer. The erotic hymns to Ishtar, once celebrating pleasure as divine, were rewritten to emphasize discipline and guilt. And yet, in fragments, rebellion survives. On one surviving clay tablet, a scribe secretly etched a line outside the official text: "The gods made sweetness in the flesh and bitterness in the heart. Which shall man obey?" The question remains unanswered. Perhaps it was never meant to be. Babylon's glory was not built on conquest alone. It was built on the regulation of the most intimate part of being human. In mastering desire, the empire believed it had mastered chaos, but it also mastered hypocrisy. For the city that worshipped love's goddess could not love freely. The civilization that claimed to civilize the world began by shackling its own heart. The Euphrates moved like a god, slow, deliberate, and merciless. Its waters shimmered beneath the sun, as priests led the condemned woman forward, her wrists bound in woven hemp, her eyes blindfolded to keep her from seeing the faces that judged her. Around her, the city gathered in silence. The accusation was adultery. The sentence was the ordeal of water. In Babylon, the river did not simply irrigate fields or feed canals, it rendered verdicts. The Code of Hammurabi prescribed it plainly. If the wife of a man has been accused by her husband, and she has not been caught lying with another man, she shall leap into the river for her husband. No proof, no witness, no defense, only water. The river was both judge and executioner. Its current believed to carry the voice of Shamash, the god of justice. The ritual was spectacle disguised as piety. The priests began by invoking the gods to witness purity. They poured oil into the water, If the surface rippled unevenly, it was said the gods were angry. The accused stood on the edge, the crowd watching for any sign of hesitation. Hesitation was guilt, composure was defiance. Then, at the command of the high priest, she was pushed forward. If she sank and drowned, her guilt was confirmed. The river had claimed her dishonor and restored cosmic balance. But if she floated, she was declared innocent, and yet many who survived found no safety. Survival itself invited suspicion. How could one defy the river the whisper went? The gods, it seemed, offered no mercy without irony. This was ritualized justice, a system where truth depended on death. To die was to prove innocence. To live was to risk exile. The logic was immaculate in its cruelty. In Babylon, the divine was never wrong, and so the human body bore the cost of maintaining heaven's infallibility. Archaeological accounts describe similar trials across Mesopotamia. Canals designated as sacred channels, priests marking the banks with clay cones bearing prayers. The ritual was public, not because the state sought transparency, but because it needed performance. Pain must be seen to remain believable. When the crowd gasped, as the woman vanished beneath the current, they were not witnessing tragedy. They were witnessing the renewal of order. Every participant played a role. The priests confirmed divine will. The husband received justice. The spectators received reassurance that their world still obeyed the gods. Even the river, indifferent and eternal, became a silent partner in the theatre of law. But beneath the ceremony lay terror's true genius. The ordeal was less about discovering truth than manufacturing obedience. When justice is left to the elements, no one can argue against it. Who dares question the river? Who challenges the gods by replacing evidence with ritual? Babylon eliminated dissent before it began. Fear was not imposed, it was inherited. The ordeal by water was particularly directed at women whose virtue the empire considered fragile and therefore dangerous. The male body was subject to law, the female body was subject to fate. It was a hierarchy carved not just in stone, but in theology. If the gods ruled through nature, and women were closer to nature, then their punishment too must be natural. Water purified them even as it devoured them. Imagine the scene from above the courtyards leading to the river lined with torches, the chants echoing against the limestone walls, the high priest's bronze ornaments catching the light. As the accused was led down her veil, symbol of respectability was torn away. To the crowd, this was not humiliation, it was transformation. She was no longer a wife or daughter or lover. She was an offering. Those who drowned were said to join the gods beneath the current. Their deaths were recorded as cosmic balance restored. Those who lived became living contradictions, reminders that the divine could err, and thus they were cursed. Some fled into exile, others became temple slaves bound to serve the gods who had spared them. Innocence, it seemed, was a different kind of sentence. Even the Euphrates itself bore witness to centuries of these trials. Excavations near Sippar uncovered wooden platforms and mooring stones used for ritual immersions alongside tablets listing names half eroded, half remembered. Each line a life reduced to accusation and water. The river ever shifting erased their graves daily. And yet the ordeal's endurance tells us more than its brutality. It reveals a civilization obsessed with visible justice. Babylon did not hide punishment in dungeons. It displayed it beneath the open sky. To see was to believe, and to believe was to obey. Every ripple of the river reaffirmed divine hierarchy. God above king. King above man, man, above woman, and woman above nothing. Still, not all bowed quietly. There are rare fragments, scribal records whispering dissent. One tablet cracked and incomplete preserves a line attributed to a court scribe. The river judges not the heart, only the weight. A dangerous truth disguised as observation. Even in Babylon, someone dared to notice that justice floated not because it was divine, but because it was light. The ordeal of water outlived Hammurabi, echoing through later empires. The Hebrews called it Mayim ha-morim, the waters of bitterness. In medieval Europe, witches faced it under new gods and new names. Every civilization, it seems, finds its own river, real or symbolic, where it drowns the inconvenient. When you stand today beside the Euphrates, its modern banks littered with reeds and silence, it's easy to forget that this water once decided who lived and who died. Yet the current still carries the memory of bodies once flung into it, innocent and guilty alike. The sun still gilds its surface, and somewhere beneath the sand, clay tablets still sleep with the names of the accused. Babylon called it justice. History calls it obedience by drowning. And the river, it calls nothing. It just moves on. In the heart of Babylon, beneath the gaze of the god Shamash, marriage was not a celebration, it was a contract. The temple scribes who prepared these unions did not write love stories. They wrote transactions. Clay tablets sealed with the impressions of witnesses outlined every condition of the bond. The dowry, the bride price, the inheritance clause, the penalty for disobedience. The home was a courtroom, the bed an extension of law. To marry in Babylon was to enter an economy of obedience. The ceremony itself reflected this hierarchy. The groom took his bride a phrase that in Akkadian carried the same legal force as seizing property. The bride's father transferred not affection but authority. In the eyes of the law, she ceased to belong to her birth family and became an annex of her husband's domain. Her hands were adorned with jewelry that gleamed like freedom but weighed like chains. The dowry system, ostensibly protection, was in truth a ledger of control. Gold, livestock, or grain given by her father was not a gift. It was a safeguard against abandonment. An insurance policy the woman herself could not touch. Should she displease her husband, he could send her away, keeping the goods that accompanied her body. The Code of Hammurabi stated it clearly. If a man wish to divorce his wife, who has not borne him children, he shall give her her dowry and let her go. At first glance, this seems merciful, but the mercy belonged to property, not personhood. A woman's worth was measured by fertility. To be barren was not a misfortune, it was a breach of contract. Thus, many marriage agreements included a chilling clause, the right to take a concubine if the wife fails to give birth within 2 years. Love could be replaced as easily as a defective plough. Inside Babylonian households, affection bowed to surveillance. Every act of domestic life, meals, dress. Childbirth was governed by expectation. Wives were instructed to veil in public, to speak softly, to obey without hesitation. The law made even emotion taxable. Jealousy, for instance, was legally irrelevant. Loyalty mandatory. A husband could take multiple wives, but a wife's heart was to belong entirely to one master. This hierarchy extended to every level of society. The noblewoman's marriage was a political alliance sealed in silver and ritual, while the commoner's union was a working contract of labor and survival. Slaves too married, though their unions were not recognized by law. Their children automatically belonged to the master. In this way, Babylon turned family into a factory of ownership. What makes these records haunting is not their brutality, but their precision. One tablet found in the ruins of Sippar details the conditions of a union between a man named Idin Sin and a woman named Amat Shamash. If she speaks disrespectfully, he may strike her. If she spends silver without consent, she shall repay it tenfold. Even silence had value, obedience a price. And yet, amid this machinery of submission, fragments of defiance surface. Some wives, wealthy or cunning, learned to use the code's own clauses as shields. If a husband failed to provide sustenance, she could appeal to the temple court and reclaim her dowry. A few records show women divorcing men for cruelty, though such victories were celebrated quietly like heresy whispered through the walls. Still, the broader truth remained. Love was a regulated commodity. The Babylonian marriage ritual did not promise companionship. It promised stability. It was the domestic reflection of the empire itself, a structure of rigid obedience, dressed in divine language. Just as Hammurabi's laws maintained cosmic order through fear, the household maintained social order through submission. The temple played its part with bureaucratic sanctity. Priests blessed the union in the name of Ishtar, goddess of fertility and war, a reminder that passion and power shared the same altar. Offerings of bread oil and honey were placed before the idols. The couple clasped hands, and the priest invoked the god's favor, may she bear sons, and may he rule his house. The prayer was not for love, but for lineage. Afterward, a feast followed music, wine, and the illusion of joy. But beneath the laughter ran a silent understanding. This was not union between equals. It was the alignment of duty. The bride's body became both altar and asset, her fertility the measure of her faithfulness. To the Babylonians, obedience was divine. Every household mirrored the cosmos man as sun, woman, as moon orbiting his authority. Even affection was expected to revolve around hierarchy. The husband's desire was lawful, the wife's desire conditional. In this framework, intimacy itself became a ritual of control. And yet even empires cannot legislate the heart. A fragmentary poem from the reign of Samsu-Iluna Hammurabi's son offers a glimpse of what the law tried to erase. My love is a garden walled by decree, yet the vine grows through the cracks. The anonymous scribe who wrote it risked blasphemy. To love without permission was to challenge the entire cosmic order. The marriage of obedience, as modern historians call it, was more than social convention. It was a political technology. By transferring control of women from fathers to husbands, the state ensured that property lineage and loyalty flowed in predictable lines. The home became the smallest unit of empire, a microcosm of Hammurabi's ideology: harmony through hierarchy, peace through possession. Today the clay contracts lie silent in museum glass, their cuneiform strokes as sharp as the day they were pressed. They record not only laws, but the architecture of fear, the ways civilization tames chaos, by binding affection to authority. In their geometry, one truth remains unbroken. The first empire to codify justice also codified love into submission. Babylonian marriage was not about companionship, it was about control. And in that control, the empire found its most enduring institution, the obedient heart. The paradox of Babylon began where the law met the altar, where holiness and desire occupied the same body. In the temples of Ishtar, the goddess of love and war sexuality was once divine. There, beneath columns carved with stars and lions, women offered themselves not to men, but to gods. What later empires would call sin, Babylon first called worship. This practice, recorded by Herodotus and echoed in cuneiform hymns, was neither vulgar nor secret. It was ritualized union meant to channel fertility into the land to ensure that the womb of the earth mirrored the womb of woman. Priestesses known as Naditu, Ishtaritu, or Kadishtu, depending on their temple, served as intermediaries between mortal and divine. Their touch was sanctified, their bodies instruments of cosmic renewal. Yet the sanctity was conditional. The same city that glorified love as divine soon learned to weaponize it. As the priesthood grew powerful and the law hardened under Hammurabi's successors, sacred sexuality transformed into controlled economy. The temple became both sanctuary and state enterprise. Every ritual act was recorded, taxed, and administered. Devotion turned into ledger. The body, once seen as the gateway to the gods, became a commodity of the state. The transformation was gradual, almost invisible. At first, the priestesses of Ishtar held immense respect. They were literate, autonomous, and wealthy, often managing temple lands. But as Babylon's patriarchal order deepened, the myth of purity devoured the reality of freedom. A woman who once embodied divinity was recast as its defiler. The sacred body became the temple of sin. Clay tablets from the Kassite period reveal this shift. Administrative records begin to describe women in temple service, not as Qadishtu holy ones, but as harimtu, a word that evolved into harlot. It was not that the rituals changed, but that power reinterpreted them. What had once been communion now became corruption. Babylon did not abolish sacred sexuality, it rebranded it as guilt. In doing so, the empire achieved something chilling. It legislated desire. It told its citizens what kind of pleasure was acceptable and what kind was criminal. The priests decreed that true devotion required abstinence, while the courts decreed that disobedience required spectacle. Thus, the same body could be sacred in 1 hour and condemned in the next. Archaeologists have found temple inscriptions recording offerings made by men to the house of the harimtu payments that blurred the line between tithe and transaction. These were not anonymous exchanges. Each act was performed under ritual supervision, sanctified by chant. Yet centuries later, scribes and moralists would rewrite this history as evidence of decadence. The priestess who had once symbolized fertility now symbolized shame. This redefinition of holiness served a deeper logic control through contradiction. By allowing the body to be both revered and reviled, the empire could manipulate both obedience and guilt. The citizen learned to fear pleasure while depending on it for salvation. That tension between sanctity and sin was the cornerstone of Babylon's moral psychology. One surviving hymn, The Descent of Inanna, captures this duality in mythic form. The goddess of love descends into the underworld, stripped of her jewels, garments, and power at each gate. By the time she stands before the Queen of Death, she is naked and humiliated. Scholars interpret this as an allegory of purification, but within Babylon's context, it also reads as political instruction. Even the divine feminine must be humbled before the law. The humiliation of goddesses mirrored the fate of their priestesses. Public punishments for temple corruption became a regularized ritual. Women accused of violating chastity vows were paraded through the courtyards of the very temples they once served. Their hair was cut, their faces smeared with ash, and sometimes they were branded with heated bronze across the abdomen, a mark over the place of creation, transforming the womb into a site of warning. These punishments were not private justice, they were liturgy. The crowd's silence as a branded woman screamed was considered part of the ritual. The priests justified it as purification pain, as prayer. And yet behind the language of holiness lay an unmistakable truth. Babylon had turned worship into a mechanism of control. The state benefited directly. Temples were tax centers, landlords, and courts. The management of sacred women became administrative labor. When the high priest declared a woman impure, her property reverted to the temple. Guilt generated profit. Religion and economy fused seamlessly, as if sin itself had an exchange rate. And the citizens believed. They believed that to see a woman punished was to preserve order, that to hear her wail was to protect the city's crops, that her blood spilled in public view would make the gods merciful. This faith, rooted in terror, became the backbone of Babylon's spiritual empire. Yet, even within this cruelty, remnants of rebellion whisper through the records. In one fragmentary hymn discovered near Kish, a temple singer wrote, "They call me defiled, yet I sing the song that calls the rain." Her words, half erased, survive as testimony proof that even within captivity, the sacred refused to vanish. By the time of Nebuchadnezzar the Sod, the lines between temple and brothel had blurred completely in popular memory. Outsiders like the Greeks would later caricature these rites as perversions, misunderstanding that what they saw was not sensuality, but its suppression, a civilization punishing what it once adored. Babylon's sin was not excess, it was amnesia. It forgot that holiness and cruelty can wear the same mask. And so the temples that once promised transcendence became prisons of flesh. Women who had embodied the goddess were rewritten as warnings. The incense that once sanctified love now burned to disguise the stench of blood. Babylon called it purification. History calls it erasure, the sacred body. Once the empire's bridge to the divine was broken, renamed and sold back as sin. Justice in Babylon was not confined to temples or courts. It was performed under the open sky, before merchant slaves and priests, each audience member a participant in the city's great moral drama. The punishments of the flesh were not secrets whispered in darkness, but declarations shouted in daylight. Babylon believed that pain purified not only the sinner, but the spectator. Every execution was both sermon and spectacle. The Code of Hammurabi defined this theatre with terrifying precision. It listed crimes and corresponding punishments with mathematical order. If a builder constructs a house and it collapses, killing the owner, the builder shall be put to death. If a son strikes his father, his hands shall be cut off. If a wife dishonors her husband, she shall be cast into the river. Each law read like a stage direction. Each sentence turned flesh into moral architecture. Public squares became amphitheaters of obedience. The condemned were paraded through the marketplace escorted by guards bearing torches and drums. At dawn, the priests intoned hymns to Shamash, the god of justice, and to Ereshkigal, goddess of the underworld, inviting both heaven and hell to attend. The executioner, cloaked in ritual robes, was not seen as a killer, but as a sacred functionary. The instruments of pain whips irons. Brands were purified with smoke before they touched the body. Violence in Babylon was never random. It was liturgy. The punishments themselves varied by status and crime. A noble might lose property or endure exile. A slave might lose limbs. A man who violated the temple or defied royal command could be impaled on stakes along the city's walls, his body left to hang until the vultures stripped it clean. Records from Uruk and Sippar describe branding across the face and torso, a mark of eternal shame. For women, the preferred spectacle was drowning or public stripping, the destruction of dignity as both punishment and entertainment. Spectators gathered not out of sadism but conviction. They believed they were watching the gods restore balance. Children perched on fathers' shoulders, vendors sold bread and figs, and priests recited verses as the whip cracked against skin. The cries of the condemned mingled with the chants of purity. The message was unmistakable. Justice must be seen to exist. Babylon had no prisons because it did not need them. Memory was its cell. To witness pain was to internalize fear. This was the essence of law as performance. Punishment was not an act of retribution, but of communication. Each mutilated body told a story that words could not. The builder's death warned of incompetence. The adulteress's drowning promised social stability. The thief's mutilation restored moral order. Fear replaced persuasion. The empire ruled less through armies than through imagination. One cuneiform record from the reign of Hammurabi's successor, Samsu-Iluna, describes an execution in detail. The man who broke the temple vow was brought before the people. His tongue was cut so that he could not speak falsehood again. His blood was sprinkled at the gate, and the people rejoiced. It was not just justice, it was choreography. Each cut had meaning, each scream an audience. Such scenes etched themselves into collective memory. A Babylonian child did not need to read the law tablet. He saw it living in the flesh of others. Fear became education. The public theatre of pain created a shared vocabulary between ruler and ruled. Silence meant survival, obedience meant safety. This psychological conditioning, perfected through repetition, turned brutality into normalcy. Yet, beneath the solemn chants and ritual precision, voyeurism thrived. The spectacle offered forbidden pleasure disguised as piety. The same crowd that condemned lust in temples now feasted their eyes on naked bodies in punishment. Shame became entertainment, sanctioned by faith. The priests called it purification, but the people called it justice, and both found satisfaction in the sight of suffering. Babylon's rulers understood this duality. They weaponized it. By transforming violence into moral ceremony, they ensured loyalty without resistance. The citizen did not fear the king directly. He feared being watched by the gods while others watched him. The entire society became an audience, performing for itself, bound together by mutual surveillance. Over time, the machinery of spectacle grew elaborate. Punishments coincided with festivals, aligning civic terror with celebration. During the spring rites of Akitu, when the king renewed his divine mandate, public floggings and executions reminded the populace that purity was purchased in pain. The crowd's cheers were indistinguishable from prayers. What distinguished Babylon from mere tyranny was not its cruelty, but its coherence. The system worked. The city remained orderly, its markets thriving, its priests wealthy. Violence had become a renewable resource, each display replenishing faith in the system. The spectacle was so effective that it required no justification. The mere act of watching was proof of righteousness. And yet the legacy of this theatre extended far beyond its riverbanks. Later empires, from Persia to Rome, would imitate its grammar of power, the public square as pulpit, the body as bulletin board, the law as theatre. Even today, echoes remain when humiliation is televised, when punishment is shared for spectacle rather than justice. Babylon's genius was not invention, but demonstration. It proved that the most enduring empires are not built on soldiers, but on audiences. In the end, the public theatre of pain was Babylon's truest temple. It sanctified fear, baptized cruelty, and made obedience eternal. The city's citizens left each execution not merely horrified, but cleansed. They had witnessed the gods at work. And as the drums faded and the blood dried under the Mesopotamian sun, one truth settled over the crowd like dust. Justice was not something to understand. It was something to watch. By the time Babylon reached its imperial height, pain had ceased to be punishment. It had become theology. Every cry, every lash, every mutilated body carried meaning. The priests of Shamash, Ishtar, and Marduk preached that suffering was the only language the gods truly heard. To hurt was to purify. To bleed was to atone. The empire did not hide its cruelty, it sanctified it. This transformation was deliberate. As Babylon grew wealthier, its rulers needed a moral logic to preserve hierarchy. They found it in divine pain. The priests declared that the gods themselves had suffered to create the world Marduk, who split the body of the chaos dragon Tiamat to form heaven and earth. Inanna, who descended into the underworld, stripped of her garments and was hung upon a hook or before resurrection. Suffering, they said, was not a flaw in creation, it was its foundation. Thus, human agony mirrored divine precedent. Every punishment enacted on earth reenacted a cosmic drama. When a thief was branded, it was said that Shamash marked him with the sun's fire, to remind mortals that justice burned. When a woman was drowned for adultery, the Euphrates itself was invoked as the river that separates purity from corruption. The rituals were not barbaric anomalies, they were extensions of myth. From temple schools to royal courts, this idea seeped into every layer of society. Children learned it through proverbs carved into clay. The gods favor the obedient, they humble the proud. Farmers repeated it when drought struck. Soldiers whispered it when wounds festered. Pain was the evidence of divine attention. To suffer was to be noticed by heaven. But what began as theology soon became policy. The priesthood discovered that suffering could organize the world. If pain was sacred, then those who inflicted it were priests of order. The executioner became a minister of cosmic balance, the judge, a prophet of fear. The Code of Hammurabi, with its relentless symmetry, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, functioned as both legal system and liturgy. Justice was no longer about truth. It was about equilibrium. One hymn from the Temple of Shamash describes the god as the light that burns away deceit. The line sounds poetic until you realize how literally it was taken. Torches were used to sear the tongues of liars. Molten metal was poured into the mouths of false witnesses. Illumination became punishment. The empire equated physical agony with moral revelation. The priests insisted that the gods demanded these offerings, that without ritual pain and the balance of creation would collapse. They spoke of plagues, floods, and famine as punishments for leniency. The message was clear. Mercy was rebellion. To question cruelty was to endanger the city itself. And so, compassion became blasphemy. This doctrine was more than superstition, it was political genius. By embedding violence into the language of worship, Babylon turned obedience into instinct. No soldier had to enforce faith. Fear did it silently. The citizen who trembled at the sight of punishment was not only afraid of rulers, he was afraid of losing divine favor. Terror became devotion. Archaeological records confirm how deeply this belief system penetrated daily life. At the great temple of Eanna in Uruk, a slab inscribed with ritual codes instructs priests to cleanse the altar with blood of goat or with the blood of sinner. The equivalence was exact. Human pain could substitute for animal sacrifice when the gods were displeased. In later centuries, under the Chaldeans, offerings of living punishment were staged before holy statues. The condemned left to die in silence as incense filled the air. Their agony was the prayer. The economy itself mirrored this moral order. Laborers whipped on construction sites were told that their suffering built on holy structures. Women giving birth in pain were told their cries echoed Ishtar's birth pangs of creation. The empire had made endurance its creed. Pain was no longer a symptom of oppression, it was proof of belonging. And yet, the logic contained its own corruption. The more Babylon sanctified suffering, the more it required it. The priests became addicted to sacrifice, the state addicted to spectacle. The city that had once sought balance now demanded blood to sustain its illusions. To doubt was dangerous, to empathize treason. When a healer tried to ease a prisoner's wounds, he risked being accused of defying the god's will. Compassion itself had to hide. Still, there were cracks in this theology. A few surviving tablets from late Babylonian philosophy suggest that some scribes began to question the system. One fragment, often called the Lament of the Just Man, tells of a righteous servant who cries to his God, "Why do you afflict the loyal and favor the wicked? My offerings are pure, yet I am crushed like clay." The text ends without answer. Even faith had learned silence. This silence, however, was not defeat. It was the beginning of doubt. When people suffer long enough in the name of holiness, they begin to suspect that holiness is hollow. Babylon's religion of suffering could command obedience, but it could not extinguish conscience. The city endured centuries, but the questions its pain inspired endured longer. For every lash that fell, another voice whispered the forbidden thought: if pain is sacred, who profits from it? That whisper born in the shadow of ziggurats and temple fires would echo through millennia in every empire that used fear to sanctify power, in every courtroom that turned cruelty into ceremony, in every priesthood that called pain redemption. Babylon believed that agony was divine proof. But perhaps its truest revelation was this: when cruelty becomes worship, the gods are no longer in heaven. They are sitting on the throne. In Babylon, there existed punishments so dreadful that scribes dared not carve them fully into stone. They called them the rituals of reversal ceremonies, reserved for the gravest crimes defiling a temple, desecrating a god's image, or engaging in forbidden sexual acts within sacred precincts. To the priests, these offenses were not simply sins. They were cosmic disruptions, tears in the fabric of divine order. To repair them, the body of the offender had to become both altar and sacrifice. The ritual of reversal began as purification. It ended as annihilation. The condemned was brought to the temple courtyard at dawn, surrounded by an audience that included nobles, scribes, guards, and acolytes. Incense filled the air, thick as fog. The high priest, dressed in gold and blood-red linen, recited hymns to Shamash, the god of justice, and Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld. The accused knelt trembling while attendants stripped away garments, ornaments, and hair, each removal symbolizing the unraveling of identity. The priests declared, "As this body is emptied of vanity, so shall the sin be emptied from the land." The ritual turned the condemned into a mirror of the gods' own acts of creation and destruction. Just as Marduk had torn Tiamat's body to shape the heavens, the sinner's flesh would now restore divine equilibrium through dismemberment. Women accused of defiling temple vows faced a particular cruelty. Their bodies, once instruments of divine service, became instruments of example. Bound to wooden frames shaped like the goddess's star, they were displayed before the crowd. The priests anointed their skin with oil, not to heal, but to make each lash glisten in sunlight. The whipping began slowly, in rhythm with the chant, "Pain is order, pain is light." Every strike was said to appease the goddess, to cleanse her shrine of mortal stain. When the body could no longer endure, the victim was left to die under the burning sky. Her blood seeped into the temple's foundation, believed to seal away impurity. Clay jars of her ashes were buried beneath the altar with inscriptions that read, "The balance restored." The temple was washed. The chants ceased, and the spectators dispersed, cleansed by witnessing another's ruin. For male offenders, the ceremony was equally elaborate, though it often ended in a slower and more public death. Those who had committed sacrilege touching sacred relics, defying priests, or violating royal women were subjected to impalement. A sharpened stake, consecrated with incense and wine, was driven through the abdomen or groin. The body was lifted upright, the pole anchored in sand, so that gravity, not the executioner, completed the ritual. Accounts from later Assyrian and Chaldean sources describe these scenes in chilling detail. Witnesses noted the silence of the priests as the condemned writhed the calculated absence of mercy. This was no execution. It was a divine drama. The pain was not incidental. It was essential. Babylon believed that agony released divine energy, that each scream carried sin back to the heavens from which it had fallen. The ritual's logic was terrifyingly consistent. The gods punished through human hands. The priests acted as conduits. To question the justice of such suffering was to question the will of the divine itself. This theological trap made rebellion impossible. The condemned's agony was holy, and so was the crowd's fascination. The priests maintained composure, the guards enforced silence, and the citizens watched in reverent awe. What outsiders might have called sadism, Babylon called symmetry. In their cosmology, sin and punishment had to mirror each other perfectly. The seducer must die through his loins, the liar through his tongue, the defiler through his hands. The body became a legal document, its mutilations recording the restoration of order. Pain was the ink, flesh the parchment. And yet, for all its divinity, the ritual of reversal revealed the fragility of Babylon's gods. A faith that required constant sacrifice was a faith on life support. The priests feared impurity, not because it was rare, but because it was everywhere. Desire, greed, doubt. Every human impulse was a potential contagion. The only antidote was blood. The city bled itself to feel clean. There were those even within Babylon who began to doubt. A fragmentary tablet from the temple of Ishtar in Sippar records the words of an unnamed scribe. If the gods demand suffering, who cleanses them of their thirst? His words were quickly erased from the record, but the question lingered. The ritual that was meant to purify began instead to corrupt. For the ritual of reversal was not merely a ceremony, it was a worldview. It taught that power required destruction, that holiness demanded humiliation. The priests ruled not by persuasion, but by demonstration, convincing the people that to watch another's pain was to protect their own souls. Over generations, that logic embedded itself so deeply that cruelty became indistinguishable from worship. When the empire eventually fell, its gods toppled and its ziggurats buried under dust. These rituals vanished, but their ghost endured. Later empires copied the structure, if not the language. Rome's crucifixions, the Inquisition's pyres, the guillotine's stage. All descendants of Babylon's theology of spectacle. The instruments changed, the faith remained. The ritual of reversal was the heart of that inheritance. It was the moment when justice crossed the threshold into devotion, when punishment became prayer. Babylon taught the world that the surest way to make violence eternal is to call it sacred. And perhaps that is the truest reversal of all, that a civilization which sought to appease its gods through pain ended by worshipping pain itself. The Code of Hammurabi, carved into basalt nearly 4,000 years ago, promised justice that would cause the strong not to oppress the weak. Its language was absolute, its vision divine. Yet, the deeper one reads, the clearer the deception becomes. This code did not end oppression, it perfected it. The price of obedience in Babylon was paid not in taxes or tribute, but in hierarchy made sacred. Every line of the code declared equality before the gods, but not before the law. The same crime could carry opposite fates depending on who committed it. If a nobleman put out the eye of another nobleman, his own eye was taken. But if he blinded a commoner, he paid a fine in silver. A slave's eye. Worthless, no penalty required. The balance of justice was measured not in morality, but in class. Babylon's genius was in disguising inequality as divine order. Hammurabi himself stood beneath a carved relief, showing him receiving the laws from Shamash, the god of justice. The image was propaganda carved in stone, the ruler as conduit between heaven and humanity, the monarch's authority indistinguishable from the will of the divine. The laws were said to come from the gods, but every scribe knew whose hand held the chisel. Obedience to Hammurabi became obedience to heaven itself. The penalties codified this theology. The nobleman's fine was the merchant's mutilation and the slave's death. Hierarchy became ritualized pain, each class allotted its proper degree of suffering. Even mercy was stratified. A wealthy man could buy forgiveness through offerings. A laborer could only endure punishment. The same divine justice that claimed to elevate morality was, in truth, a marketplace of bodies and coin. Public punishment reinforced this illusion of fairness. The crowd saw law applied, but not equally. A merchant flogged for fraud, a servant branded for theft, a priest pardoned for corruption. The people witnessed hierarchy as inevitability. Babylon's law had mastered what modern power still practices injustice, disguised as order. The empire's scribes helped sustain this deception. Legal tablets survive that record the sale of justice, as if it were grain or cloth. One fragment reads, "Silver paid in full," and the judge's hand rested. The phrase meant the trial was over. The gods appeased because coin had completed the ritual. Bribery was not corruption in Babylon, it was sanctified transaction. This economic theology extended into family life. The household was a microcosm of empire. The husband mirrored the king, the wife reflected the subject. The code decreed, if a woman neglects her husband's house and is found in sin, she shall be drowned. Yet, if a husband committed the same act, he might atone by oath before the gods and return home forgiven. The asymmetry was deliberate. It transformed male dominance into divine symmetry. To challenge it was not rebellion, it was heresy. Even freedom carried its own price. A slave could buy release by saving enough silver to purchase his name from his master, but that freedom was never clean. His new status came with a brand declaring him freed by the hand of the god. Liberation was another form of subordination freedom permitted only through divine permission. The Code of Hammurabi was not a constitution, it was a performance. Its purpose was not justice, but choreography, the synchronization of fear. The people needed to believe that the same gods who governed the stars also governed their fates. A peasant struck by drought would not curse the king, he would curse himself for offending heaven. The brilliance of Babylon was that no sword was sharper than guilt. And yet cracks appeared, even in this carefully balanced edifice. Fragments of dissent survive in the oldest Babylonian laments, whispers from scribes and poets who questioned the sanctity of suffering. Why does the Lord of justice favor the oppressor? Why does the cry of the innocent go unanswered? These lines, etched faintly on broken clay, reveal the first tremors of doubt. Somewhere beneath the ziggurat's shadow, conscience stirred. But doubt too was commodified. The priests responded by inventing rituals of atonement, purchasable absolutions. A citizen who questioned the gods could sponsor a temple feast fund, a statue, or provide livestock for sacrifice. Redemption had a tariff. Babylon had monetized guilt itself. By institutionalizing inequality, the code achieved what brute force never could: permanence. The poor obeyed not because they were weak, but because they were convinced their suffering was sacred. The wealthy ruled not because they were stronger, but because they appeared chosen. Every class accepted its pain as a cosmic equation. That equation became Babylon's most enduring export. The empires that followed Persia-Rome. Byzantium all borrowed its moral calculus, divine law, legitimizing human cruelty. Even modern justice systems echo its formula in subtle ways. the unequal sentencing, the fines substituting for punishment, the myth that law itself is neutral. Babylon's ghost still lingers in every courtroom where wealth bends morality, where the poor bear the brunt of perfection's illusion. What Hammurabi carved in basalt was not just the world's first code of law. It was humanity's first mirror of hypocrisy, the blueprint for sacred inequality. It taught the world that the surest way to make injustice eternal is to make it holy. The empire's citizens bowed to their king, believing they bowed to heaven. They feared sin more than tyranny, and so they built the most obedient civilization the ancient world had ever seen. But beneath the hymns, beneath the tablets, beneath the perfect geometry of punishment, the truth whispered like wind through broken stone justice, when sold is indistinguishable from sin. Long before prisons, Babylon had another more potent weapon of control: shame. It did not leave scars on the flesh, it branded the soul. The architects of Babylonian law understood something disturbingly modern. The body heals, but reputation does not. So they made humiliation a spectacle, a ritualized theater where citizens learned not just fear of punishment, but fear of being seen. Public punishment in Babylon was never only about the condemned. It was a mirror held up to the crowd. In temple courtyards, at market squares, and before ziggurat steps, the people gathered to witness judgment rendered aloud. The herald would call out the crime in a voice that carried across the plaza: lying, adultery, theft, blasphemy. And the crowd would respond, sometimes with silence, sometimes with chants. The condemned stood at the center, stripped to the waist, hair shorn, eyes downcast. The law decreed that sin thrives in secrecy. Therefore, punishment had to be performed in sunlight. A man convicted of theft might be paraded with the stolen object tied to his neck, a tablet hung on his chest, inscribed with the words, "He took what was not his." A woman accused of infidelity could be forced to stand for hours at the temple gate, her garments torn, her shame displayed before the gods. Those spared death were marked with the sign of disgrace, a brand burned onto the cheek, the forehead, or the hand. The mark said more than guilt. It said, "Remember." This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was governance. Babylon's rulers learned early that the crowd's participation in punishment was the surest guarantee of stability. When the people watched, they became accomplices. Each gasp, each whisper, each satisfied murmur turned private judgment into collective virtue. The shame of one citizen reaffirmed the purity of the others. In a society where the gods saw everything, public humiliation was divine theater. The priests often presided over these rituals, reciting hymns as the punishments unfolded. The chants were meant to cleanse the air of impurity, but in truth, they sanctified voyeurism. The citizens came not only to witness justice, but to feel moral. Babylon taught them that to see another suffer was to be reminded of one's own righteousness. One surviving inscription from the city of Sippar describes a punishment for a merchant who cheated customers with false weights. He shall stand before the market. It reads, holding the stone of his deceit, while the buyers laugh and point. Another tablet records that a servant who disobeyed his master was stripped chained to the city gate and forced to recite his offense aloud until sunset. His punishment was not just his pain, but his performance. This was the birth of moral spectacle pain transformed into pedagogy. The state no longer needed to hide its violence. It needed witnesses. The lesson was simple. If you disobey, you will not vanish. You will be remembered forever as an example. Babylon turned shame into immortality. But shame, unlike the whip, seeps inward. It teaches obedience even without presence. A branded slave no longer needed guards. The mark itself enslaved him socially. A disgraced woman could live free, but every neighbor's glance became another chain. Babylon discovered that the most efficient prison was reputation. The mechanism worked because it inverted guilt. Once publicly condemned, a person could never be cleansed, not by repentance, not by prayer. The priests spoke of atonement, but the crowd remembered only the spectacle. In this way, shame became self-perpetuating. The condemned carried their punishment like a shadow, and the sight of their suffering reaffirmed the hierarchy of purity. The psychological power of this system cannot be overstated. For the first time in recorded history, a civilization institutionalized emotional control as policy. The law did not simply regulate behavior, it colonized identity. People learned to police themselves long before soldiers had to. Every citizen became both enforcer and spectator. In time, Babylon exported this invisible discipline across generations. The Romans would later perfect it, in arenas the medieval church in its inquisitions, modern states in their prisons and media. But the prototype was here in these plazas, where a trembling merchant confessed his deceit, where a branded slave hid his face from the market he once served. Babylon's architects of law understood that physical pain ends, but humiliation endures indefinitely. The invention of shame did not just maintain order, it manufactured loyalty. To avoid disgrace, citizens offered offerings to temples, performed rituals, confessed sins they had not committed. The state no longer had to coerce them, they coerced themselves. And yet, in this labyrinth of public morality, there were those who saw the rot. A clay fragment from late Babylonian literature preserves a chilling line. They say the gods see all. I think it is men who see too much. The author remains unknown. Perhaps a scribe who had witnessed one humiliation too many. The line suggests something profound, that Babylon's real surveillance system was not divine, but social. To live in such a city was to live constantly, watched, weighed, and measured. The fear of exposure replaced the fear of death. The whip ruled less than the gaze. The priest's hymn, the merchant's laughter, the neighbor's whisper, all became instruments of control. And that is Babylon's true legacy, not the stone codes, nor the rituals of fire, but the invention of the invisible chain. The understanding that to rule a people, you need not break their bones, you need only make them afraid of being seen. Because once shame becomes sacred, the soul polices itself. Control in Babylon did not begin with violence. It began with belief. By the time Hammurabi's empire reached its height, the machinery of domination had become almost invisible. The citizens of Babylon obeyed not because soldiers stood behind them, but because gods hovered above them, omniscient, omnipresent, and mercilessly attentive. The brilliance of the Babylonian system was that it transformed power from an external force into an internal voice. People no longer needed to be ruled. They ruled themselves through fear of divine judgment. The city was built like a nervous system. At its center stood the ziggurat, the temple mountain reaching toward the heavens. From it radiated a network of smaller temples, administrative courts, and patrol routes. Each space reinforced the same message: you are being watched. The gods see the priests record the scribes' right, and the king enforces. Law, religion, and surveillance formed a single structure, an early form of psychological governance. The priests called it harmony. The scribes called it order. But what it truly was submission engineered through ritual. A man who failed to make an offering feared drought plague or the ruin of his crops. A woman who failed to obey her husband feared divine retribution on her children. Fear became currency traded daily in temples where guilt was weighed and forgiven for a price. Every confession was a transaction. Every ritual was a receipt. Babylon perfected the economy of obedience. Children were taught this system from birth. In school, tablets uncovered by archaeologists, students copied lines like, "He who defies his teacher defies the gods." Punishment in classrooms was ritualized, beatings administered in the name of discipline, mirroring how the state punished citizens in the name of justice. The ideology was consistent. From cradle to coffin, pain purifies, authority protects. The genius of Babylon's control lay in its integration of cosmic and civic order. To break a law was not merely to offend the state, it was to unbalance the universe. When a thief stole grain, it was said that he had angered Shamash, the sun god of justice, and risked eclipsing the light itself. The punishment that followed was not framed as vengeance, but as restoration. Every lash, every branding iron, every humiliation was said to repair cosmic symmetry. This belief made rebellion impossible. The people were convinced that their suffering preserved the world. They internalized their oppression as piety. The same mechanism that justified cruelty also sanctified obedience. Babylon's priests never needed spies. Guilt was the perfect informant. In every temple stood the tablets of record lists of offerings, confessions, and transgressions. Scribes noted who gave, who abstained, who was late, who failed to attend. The records were not secret. They were displayed publicly as divine accountability. Citizens read their neighbors' names, whispered their judgments, and in doing so perpetuated control. What began as theology evolved into surveillance, a spiritual bureaucracy that turned worship into reporting. Even architecture enforced submission. The ziggurats towered over narrow alleys, casting long shadows across the living quarters. At sunset, when the city was bathed in red light, the effect was deliberate. The worshipper below looked up and felt small. The horizon itself was vertical, demanding reverence. The walls of Babylon did not just protect, they instructed. Control extended into the rhythm of time. Every hour was regulated by temple bells, every season by religious festivals. To skip a ritual or forget a fast was to invite suspicion. The citizen's life was measured, recorded, and categorized until obedience became instinct. The empire's stability did not depend on force, but on conformity. So deep, it felt natural. And yet, within this vast system of devotion, there was profound loneliness. The same ideology that bound people to the gods also severed them from each other. Empathy became dangerous. It risked weakening the chain of control. When a neighbor was punished, pity could be seen as complicity. When a friend confessed sin, compassion could be mistaken for disloyalty to the gods. Babylon's psychology of obedience thrived by isolating the individual inside the architecture of fear. The priests and judges understood that the body could resist, but the mind could surrender indefinitely. The lash could make a man rebel, but shame made him obedient forever. Babylon's genius was to transfer authority from the throne to the conscience. The gods did not need to punish directly. The believer did it for them. Archaeologists have found clay figurines buried beneath homes, tiny effigies with hands bound or mouths sealed. They were offerings to ward off guilt, miniature sacrifices of silence. Imagine living in a city where even your thoughts required confession, where dreaming of disobedience could invite divine scrutiny. That was Babylon's triumph. It conquered not only the body, but the imagination. In this psychological empire, every ritual reinforced the same lesson: power is natural and submission is moral. The citizens believed that their suffering preserved cosmic balance, that obedience was holiness. They knelt, prayed, paid, and performed because the alternative was unthinkable: the collapse of heaven itself. Millennia later, the ruins of Babylon still whisper this paradox, that the most enduring tyranny is not enforced by chains or swords, but by belief. Once fear becomes faith, and obedience becomes virtue, the human mind becomes the temple and the prison at once. And within that architecture of the soul, the empire never truly fell. The empire fell quietly, not with fire or revolt, but with exhaustion. By the 6th century BCE, Babylon's towers still glimmered in the desert light, but the faith that had sustained them was already crumbling from within. The priests still chanted, the scribes still wrote, but the gods were growing silent. The city that once believed itself eternal began to forget what its obedience was for. When Cyrus of Persia entered Babylon in 539 BCE, there was no siege. The gates opened at night. The soldiers marched in unopposed. The citizens greeted them with relief. The great experiment in divine law ended not in battle, but in indifference. Babylon, the mother of Marduk's law, had become its own prisoner, so bound by ritual that it could not imagine rebellion. Its people had been taught to mistake submission for peace, and so they surrendered without a word. Cyrus issued his proclamation in the language of liberation. He promised that the gods of Babylon would be honored, that their temples would be respected, that the old order would continue under new names. It was a masterstroke of psychological conquest. The Persians didn't need to destroy Babylon. They simply inherited its system of control. The priests blessed their new rulers, the scribes carved new decrees, and the rituals resumed. The empire had changed hands, but the theology of obedience survived intact. Over the next centuries, the ziggurats decayed. The canals that once fed the city silted over. The Euphrates shifted its course. Farmers abandoned the fields, leaving behind inscriptions half buried in dust. Shamash see me, I have done no wrong. The gods no longer answered. The rituals had outlived belief. Babylon's greatest achievement, the fusion of divinity and power, had also been its doom. A system that demanded total order left no room for renewal. And yet Babylon did not die. It metastasized. Its ruins became scripture. Its code became template. The very stones of its temple walls, scattered by time, carried ideas that no conqueror could bury. The Persians absorbed its bureaucracy. The Greeks absorbed its astrology. The Romans absorbed its law. Each empire learned from Babylon's experiment that the most stable societies are built not by force, but by conviction. Even as its gods faded, the city's logic endured. The philosopher kings of Greece translated Babylonian order into rational hierarchy. Roman jurists turned divine justice into imperial law. The church later baptized it into theology. As above, so below, they said, never realizing that they were echoing the priests of Shamash. The Babylonian dream of cosmic order had become the Western dream of civilization itself. Archaeologists who unearthed Babylon in the 19th century found more than ruins. They found a memory system fossilized in clay. Tablets recording not only taxes and trade, but confessions, punishments, and prayers. One inscription reads, "May my shame be lifted. May my obedience be known." Even in death, the citizens sought validation through submission. The echo of obedience had outlived its empire. Standing today among the broken bricks, it's easy to imagine that the city simply collapsed under time's indifference. But listen carefully, and the silence has shape. The same geometry that once dictated the order of the heavens, the same symmetry carved into Hammurabi's code, still whispers through our institutions, our courts, our ideologies. Babylon was the first to turn law into language power, into morality, and submission into virtue. The ruins are not mute, they are mirrors. There is something profoundly unsettling about this inheritance. Every civilization that came after Babylon, from Rome to London to Washington, inherited its paradox that justice requires hierarchy, that peace requires obedience. Even when the gods changed names, the structure remained. The idea that law must sanctify suffering did not vanish. It evolved, refined, secularized. Babylon's fall, then, was not an ending, but a migration. Its spirit flowed into the empires that followed each, claiming to rise higher while building on the same foundation of fear. The code became parchment, the temple became court, the priest became judge. The vocabulary changed, but the ritual endured. In the ruins of Babylon, archaeologists found a clay tablet cracked in half. On one side, the words, "To the God who sees me." On the other, unfinished lines that fade mid-sentence. "Do not let my shame be. The rest is gone." Perhaps erased by time, perhaps left deliberately blank. It is a fitting fragment, an unfinished prayer from a civilization that taught the world how to speak obedience. The echo of Babylon is not only historical, it is psychological. Every time we justify cruelty as necessary order, every time we confuse law with morality, we speak in Babylonian. Its bricks crumble, but its ideas still hold. Its gods are dead, but its methods live. The ruins are not ruins at all. They are the architecture beneath our conscience. Babylon fell 25 centuries ago, but its logic, the marriage of morality and control, did not. It survived migration, conquest, translation, and rebranding. Every age built a new Babylon in its own image. The ziggurat became the skyscraper, the priest became the pundit, and the ritual of humiliation became entertainment. In ancient Babylon, punishment was theatre. In the modern world, it is broadcast. The same instinct that once gathered citizens at the temple gates now gathers them around glowing screens. Where crowds once watched a thief paraded with stones tied to his neck, millions now watch strangers shamed in public, exposed, ridiculed, digitally drowned. The medium has changed. The appetite has not. Public disgrace remains our oldest civic ritual. social media is the new Euphrates swift, merciless cleansing by drowning. One accusation flows into another. The crowd gathers not to judge fairly, but to participate, to reaffirm their own innocence through the destruction of another's. Every retweet, every comment, every screenshot, another lash of the modern whip. And like the citizens of Babylon, we tell ourselves it is justice. We call it accountability, as they called it purification. But the architecture of feeling is identical. Modern states have perfected the same moral theatre under different names. Surveillance cameras in cities, data tracking in phones, biometric scans at borders, each promising safety, each whispering obedience. Where Hammurabi carved his code in stone, we have etched ours in algorithms. The gods no longer see from the heavens, they read from the cloud. And just as Babylon's citizens internalized fear of divine eyes, we internalize the awareness of being watched. We curate our lives for the invisible audience, self-censoring before the algorithm punishes us. The priests of Shamash once kept ledgers of guilt and offering. Today, our ledgers are digital, vast, and permanent. The logic is ancient. The most efficient control is the one people enforce upon themselves. The language of purity has also evolved. Babylon punished the impure body. Modern society punishes the impure opinion. Shame has become a moral currency again, traded daily in digital marketplaces. Outrage replaces reflection, and public confession replaces reform. Like the branded slaves of old, those who fall from grace carry their stigma forever. The crowd forgets the details, but never the mark. Political systems too echo the old empire's methods. Babylon ruled by merging law and theology. Today, governments merge security with morality. Every war becomes holy when justified as defense of order. Every surveillance network becomes sanctified as protection. We tell ourselves that these systems preserve civilization. Babylon told itself the same. Even religion carries the old pattern forward. The belief that pain purifies, that suffering redeems, that obedience equals virtue. These ideas have flowed seamlessly through Christian penitence, Islamic submission, Hindu karmic hierarchy. The names change, but the moral geometry remains the sacred, always demands subordination. Babylon's priests may be gone, but the theology of submission still rules hearts dressed in the vocabulary of salvation, progress, or law. And art, our last refuge, has not escaped it either. We immortalize cruelty as spectacle, calling it realism. True crime documentaries, gladiatorial sports humiliation as entertainment. The ritual of pain has merely found a new stage. Babylon burned incense. We stream it in 4K. Yet this persistence is not merely imitation. It reveals something elemental about humanity, the desire to see order made visible through suffering. The ancients built temples to justify it. We build institutions. They drowned the accused in rivers. We drown them in headlines. They feared divine wrath. We fear social irrelevance. The emotion underneath is identical, a need to belong to the righteous crowd. Occasionally cracks appear. Whistleblowers, historians, survivors. Voices that remind us the system we inhabit has ancestors buried in the dust of Mesopotamia. A few recognize the pattern and recoil. But most continue performing because to step outside the theatre is to lose identity. In Babylon, to reject ritual was to risk divine punishment. Today, it means exile from the digital tribe. The modern Babylon is not a place. It is a structure of perception. It exists wherever shame masquerades as morality, wherever obedience is praised as virtue, wherever watching replaces understanding. It lives in courts that punish appearance more than action, in governments that trade privacy for peace, in cultures that confuse cruelty with justice. When the archaeologists uncovered Hammurabi's stele, they marveled at its sophistication. They saw the first written law, the dawn of civilization. Few noticed that carved beneath the god's image were scenes of punishment. Hands raised in submission, eyes lowered in fear. The monument that began as a symbol of justice was also the blueprint of surveillance. That duality enlightenment built atop fear remains the essence of every empire that followed. So, when we say modern Babylon, we are not invoking a ruin, but recognizing a reflection. We live within the same architecture of power, polished by centuries, disguised as progress. The empire's bricks have become circuits, its river a network, its gods invisible but omniscient. Babylon never fell. It simply learned to hide its ziggurat behind the mirror of civilization. The ruins of Babylon lie silent beneath the Iraqi sun. But silence is deceptive. Beneath those broken bricks and eroded tablets still lives the logic that shaped the human world, the belief that pain preserves order, that fear is the most reliable form of faith. Civilization, as we call it, began not with kindness, but with accounting. And what the Babylonians first recorded in stone, we have continued to inscribe in law, ideology, and conscience. The Code of Hammurabi stands today in a glass case at the Louvre, a monument to humanity's awakening to justice. Tourists marvel at its symmetry. 282 laws arranged in precise lines carved 4,000 years ago into black basalt. But few linger to read the crimes. Fewer still imagine the cries. The stone is cold, but it remembers heat, the friction of flesh and flame, the sound of guilt pronounced as destiny. That tablet, humanity's first lawbook, is also its first confession. We do not build order without first deciding who must suffer for it. Babylon's greatest legacy is not the code itself, but the moral pattern it created, the idea that suffering could be rational, even sacred. The city transformed cruelty into architecture, wrote it into ritual, and exported it as civilization. Every empire that came after merely updated the technology. The Romans called it discipline. The Inquisition called it penance. The colonizers called it education. The dictators called it security. Always the same principle. Obedience must be bought in blood. And yet there is something mesmerizing in Babylon's genius. It proved that domination did not need chaos. It needed choreography. The priests understood that fear loses power when it feels arbitrary. To last, it must feel holy. Hammurabi's laws offered that perfection a script, where every punishment had purpose, every death a reason. This illusion of justice, as old as those basalt lines, is the blueprint of modern governance. Even now, the state maintains its authority through ritualized suffering. Imprisonment, poverty, humiliation, all sanctified by bureaucracy instead of awe of divinity. Perhaps that is Babylon's true immortality. It taught us how to moralize harm. We may no longer pray to Shamash or Ishtar, but we still kneel before abstractions, just as merciless security. Growth, order, patriotism. words that function like gods demanding sacrifice while promising salvation. We build temples out of data centers, ziggurats out of glass towers, and when they collapse, we call it tragedy rather than pattern. The irony is unbearable and exact. The first civilization wrote law to end chaos. In doing so, it invented a more elegant form of cruelty: systematic, justified, eternal. Humanity never forgot that lesson. We refined it. Each age made its own version of Hammurabi's stele, each pretending the old blood had dried. But history bleeds through everything, through courtrooms and prisons, through wars declared for peace, through policies that punish the powerless while praising the just. When the French archaeologist Gustave Opper unearthed fragments of the Babylonian walls in 1863, he wrote that the ruins felt eerily familiar, as if the stones had already known our cities. He was right. Every tower of order carries Babylon's geometry. Every empire that rises builds its justice atop the same foundation of exclusion. Civilization, it seems, is not the opposite of barbarism. It is its perfected mask. But the ruins also whisper another truth, quieter and far more dangerous. They remind us that the gods of control are not eternal. Even the most elaborate system of fear eventually collapses under the weight of its own perfection. Babylon fell, not because its enemies were stronger, but because its faith could no longer breathe. When obedience becomes total, it destroys the very vitality it seeks to preserve. The empire of silence always ends the same way, with no one left to speak. And so the lesson of stone and blood is not only warning, it is invitation. To remember that every law, however noble, contains a shadow. Every order demands a victim. To question which part of ourselves still kneels before Babylon, the part that obeys out of fear, that watches punishment with satisfaction, that calls cruelty justice because it feels clean. The ancient city may be dust, but the temptation it offered to sanctify domination still whispers in our institutions, our ideologies, our desires. Babylon is not history. It is habit. And until we learn to build, without the architecture of fear, the ruins will keep rebuilding themselves in our courts, our screens, our minds. The first law was written in stone, but the last will be written in conscience. Whether it repeats the same sentence depends on whether we finally learn to read. Not the code, but the cost. Because when all empires fade and the tablets crack, only one question remains echoing through the dust of 4,000 years. Was our justice ever different from theirs?